So those are some of the leftovers from those two stories. God creates alone. The work of creation is relatively easy. When it was over, it's over. God defined everything at the very beginning, including sexuality. Women have a secondary place. And this world is here at our disposal. We can do whatever we want with it. Now, those are the leftovers I think we inherited from those stories. It's not that we went to the Bible and drew conclusions from them, but we heard them so much, and they were in our consciousness all the time, that we were left with that residue. And I think there are some consequences of that. And one of the consequences of that is most Catholics don't have a personal relationship with God. That's the data. And you listen to these stories of creation and you ask yourself, who would want one? Now, by way of contrast, think about your relationship to Jesus. I mean, here's someone who you can relate to. He's human like you. He struggles like you. He walked and suffered and knew what the human journey was like. He's like me. I have no trouble having a relationship to Jesus. But this God who is solitary, who seems to create effortlessly, who when he's done it's all defined, who tells us that we should subdue the earth, who created this unequal relationship between men and women, do I want a relationship with this God? I'm not so sure. But there's another story about creation. And it has a kind of a different a feel to it, a different sense to it. So listen to this other story from creation. It's from Proverbs.
The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth, when there were no depths I was brought forth, when there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth, when he had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first bits of soil. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made the firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limits, so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him, like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighted in the human race.
Now, does that warm your hearts a little bit more than those first two stories? There's a face to this God, and this God is not alone. This God seems to have a partner, that someone is accompanying God in this work of creation. And the other thing about this story is you get a sense of God getting his hands dirty in this story. He's measuring things out. He's fashioning things. There's some labor involved in this story. And there's delight. You hear in this story how God and God's partner delight in this world of creation. Delight in the human family. So there's joy in the heart of God in this story. So it invites us to imagine what was happening in the heart of God at the beginning of creation. Now, I know it's impossible for us to have sequence connected with God because in God there is no time. There's no before and after. And God is not limited by time or space. So in a sense, it's inappropriate to even imagine anything connected with time. But if we could, I'm going to share with you what I imagine happened in the heart of God. So this goes back 13.6 billion years ago, because as we know, this world that we're living in, that's when it started. That's when it first appeared. So we're going to imagine that this is what's going on in the heart of God 13.4.1 billion years ago, just before the Big Bang. What's happening in the heart of God? And this is a little bit of my imagination, but I borrowed it from a bunch of people. So I'm imagining this is what's happening in the heart of God. God is imagining all of the world that God is going to create. And God is loving, delighting in the possibilities of what God is going to fashion. And all of this, God is sharing with God's self. Imagining all of us. God is 13.6 billion years ago imagining Minnie, imagining Linda, imagining Alice, imagining Ardith. He's imagining all of us in all of our uniqueness, not as a species, but each one of us. He's imagining us and loving us from the very beginning. And he's sharing all of this with God's partner. Now, we later on discover that the partner is the Son, who we have come to know as Jesus. But in the beginning, in the heart of God, before any of that exists, there's just God and God's self delighting in their heart, ruminating about all that they're going to share. And then, in that momentary act of creation, God pours God's self out into creation. That creation had to come from somewhere. The Big Bang had to, even though scientists tell us it starts with a little thing like this and explodes and everything appears from it. But it had to come from something to start. So God pours God's self out into creation. And in a moment, boom, everything that we know comes into existence. There's this huge explosion, there's gas expanding, the universe begins to rocket apart. All of a sudden there's space, there's time. It's a marvelous story, when you think about it. 400 million years without a speck of light before the first star twinks into existence. And God is still imagining you and you and you, but waiting patiently for all this to happen. Now, you say, oh, Father Tim, that's a lovely story. Too bad it's not true. But there is a tradition that we have lost touch with that actually preserves that. And it's found in the Orthodox Church. Really interesting. So in the year 1000, we split with the East. Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, and the West, we parted company. I can't remember what the fight was about, but we haven't talked to each other since. That's a long time, 1,000 years. What's interesting is they preserved a different understanding about creation. Now, you and I are familiar with John's Gospel. In the beginning was, you know this, was the Word, and the Word was, and the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. And the Word was, so the Greek word for that is logos. In the beginning was the Word became flesh, and the Word dwelt among us. And we have this sense that Jesus is divine because Jesus came from the heart of God into the world as the logos, the Word. Now, in the Orthodox tradition, they believe that every created thing is a small L that came from the heart of God. Every tree is a logos. Every fish is a logos. Every ant is a logos. Every baby is a logos. Every created thing possesses a divine spark that came from the heart of God. Now think about when you think, and so every created thing is holy before we do anything to it. Every tree is holy. Every fish is holy. Every human being is holy by the very fact that they've come from the heart of God, from God's imagination. That's part of the Orthodox tradition. And you know something? I think we've missed it. Now, we worry about developing communion with the Lutherans and the Anglicans, and Pope Francis keeps saying we've got to patch up this relationship and recover this tradition that's part of our faith. For 1,000 years, that's what we believed. And then we parted company, and just because we're not talking to each other, we said, well, we don't agree with you, so we're not going to agree with what you do. So we lost something really precious, I think, in losing that idea of every created thing shares in the sacredness of God. Now, why is that a helpful thing? Or what are the Proverbs, and what is the Orthodox tradition? what are their gifts to us that I think Pope Francis is wanting us to celebrate? Well, one of the things they're saying in all of this is that God has invested himself in creation. God is not aloof. God is not distant, separate from creation. God has invested himself in creation, in every individual in creation. God has given a divine spark to each human being in creation, and God has spent himself in doing this. Now, in the Western tradition, we have avoided, like the plague, the idea that God could somehow be limited, because we were overly preoccupied with preserving the idea of God as the perfect being who needs nothing. And we ended up with a God who's unmoved. We can't force God to care about us. God chooses to. God emptied himself to create you. God emptied himself to create Frank and Eileen. He spent himself in creating you two. He spent himself in doing those things. He poured himself out. So at the very heart of God, you have this God who says, I'm going to give myself in order that creation might exist. I'm going to pour myself out so that creation might exist. Now think about the people that you are involved with in pastoral care. Being spent is a normal part of that experience. If you're caring for somebody, or partnering with somebody, or have a sick somebody in the family, you know what it means to be spent. You know what it means to spend yourself. You come to the end of a day and you say, I am spent. I am done in. That is the experience of the heart of God. But listen to our culture. Our culture says, no, that is to be avoided. The last thing you want to do is spend yourself. Spend somebody else maybe. Collect enough money so you can hire them to do the spending, but you are never to have the experience of being spent. That's an evil in our culture. Our culture says, save yourself. Don't spend yourself. Save yourself. Accumulate. Do not spend yourself. But the very heart of God is to be spent. The very heart of God is to empty God's self out. And the marvelous thing about this is creation gets it. The created world, shaped by this divine logos they all had in them, creation understands this. So when I was first ordained, my father and my sister and I, we made a trip out to BC, and one of the places we stopped at a spawning bed for salmon. Never seen anything like this in my life. So there's this river, it's the fall, it's October. All these mighty fish have reached this bed, and they're laying their eggs, and they're red. If you've ever seen it, they're red. They're dying. These female fish have been at sea for 7 years. They finally made their way back to where they were hatched. They're laying their eggs, and then they die. They get it. They get it because that's the heart of God. And God has done that to them. That's where they came from. They came because God had imagined them, and God poured God's self out for them. And they understand it. They get it. I have 2 sunflower plants in my backyard, and finally their faces have turned bright yellow, and their heads are filling up with seeds. And then they're going to die. They get it. They get it. They get it because they came from the heart of God. We don't get it. And it's because our culture keeps telling us, no, don't spend yourself. Don't spend yourself. Save yourself. Preserve yourself. Don't spend yourself. Save yourself. So now that you have in your minds this idea of, in the heart of God, this at the very beginning, and this is the nature and existence of God, is God is a being who pours himself out, and the pouring out we see in creation. That's the nature of God. So now listen to this description of Jesus that we get from Paul.
Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross.
Now, we grew up with that story, right? Jesus came, he left God, and he came to live among us and die among us. And we think that's a story that's unique to Jesus. No, that's the heart of God. God and his partner were doing that from the very beginning, emptying ourselves out, pouring ourselves out. The fact that Jesus empties himself out is simply because God and the Son are the same. These are the same beings. They've come together. They're the same. They're identical. This emptying out of God is the very nature of God. It is about what partnership accompanying is about. And every creature, in order to reach their fulfillment, who they are meant to be in the image and mind and heart of God, needs to get to the point where they empty them. Like those beautiful salmon and the sunflowers in the backyard. Eventually, if we're to be a full human being, we will empty ourselves out in the care and service of others. Because that's the image that's the image of God in which we were made. We were made to be emptier, to be emptied. We were made to be poured out. We were made to be emptied out in service and care of others. Exactly what pastoral care is about. Now, there's another dimension that Pope Francis, I think, has shared with us that I think is really helpful. It's really interesting that when he talks about this phenomena, he says the church will have to initiate everyone into this art of accompaniment. Interesting choice of words. He doesn't say work of accompaniment. He doesn't say ministry of accompaniment. He doesn't say labor of accompaniment. He says art of accompaniment. Interesting, when you think of the different ways you could describe this experience. Pope Francis, this is an art form. What does that mean? And what does art look like when someone practices it? Well, think about what's going on in an artist, whether it's a painter or a sculptor or whatever. They have some idea in their mind that they want to communicate. And then they make the first stroke of the brush, or they make the first pound of the hammer and the chisel into the granite. And then they look at what's happened and they reconsider. I might say, I really wanted the clouds to have this lovely bluish purple tint into them, but I think there should be some pink. So now I'm going to add some pink to the thing. And then they look back at that and say, no, that cloud needs a little bit more brown in it. They add a little brown. Or the sculptor is chiseling away and realizing, I thought the head was going to kind of point this way, but no, it's going to point this way. I better let it be. Listen to that line. Let it be. I better let it be, and I better go with it. When an artist is at work, it's not mechanical. It's not paint by number, and it's not an engineer. It's personal, and it's considered. You're always reconsidering. How did that work? Oh, God, that didn't work very well. I can tell from the look on your face that you really didn't like that idea. Let's try this. We'll try something else. Let's try this. Let's try this. Let's go over here and we'll try something else. Let's shift that and we'll go in this direction and we'll do it a little bit differently. That's the art of accompaniment. And I think that's what Pope Francis wants us to understand, that in this journey of caring for each other, we have to listen to what's happening in the life of the person that we're in front of. We have to pay attention to them. They're not a thing. And their experience will teach us something about what we're supposed to do next. I think that's why you don't have all of this in your... but this is the closing quote of that art of accompaniment, about removing our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. Pope Francis says the pace of this accompaniment, how fast is this? He says it must be steady and reassuring. Think about those words. When you're accompanying somebody, yes, you're going to have to be faithful to them, and you're going to have to assure them that this is going to work. I'm assuring them all the time that we're on the right path. Reflecting our closeness to them. We're not distant. This is not a God who's distant from us. We are close to them. And our compassionate gaze, which heals, liberates, and encourages growth in the Christian life. Our compassionate gaze. Just finish with one little note about why that compassionate gaze is so important to Francis. He owes his vocation, in part, to an encounter with the painting of the Conversion of St. Matthew by Caravaggio. You can look it up sometime, but it's a lovely painting. So in the painting, Caravaggio is imagining Jesus and the disciples, and they're standing kind of in the doorway of the tax counting house, and Jesus' finger is pointed towards this table. And at the table, there's some men dressed in medieval dress, and they're looking up at Jesus, and they have this look on their face that basically seems to say, me? Me? You're calling me? Pope Francis saw himself as the guy at the table. You're calling me? And what he understood happened was, in that moment, Jesus looked at Francis and said, I'm mercying you. He turned mercy into a verb. I'm mercying you. My gaze is changing you. My compassionate gaze is changing you and allowing you to accompany me. And so when Francis was asked early on in his papacy, who am I? He said, I am a sinner. When he was asked to introduce himself, who am I? I am a sinner. And he traces it to that encounter that he saw in the painting, this merciful gaze of Jesus that begins to transform us on our accompanying journey. So that's our little plan. We'll celebrate the Eucharist here, but on Tuesdays we're going to take another little chunk of Francis, and we'll see next week how grace accompanies every person. And then we're going to look at how we accompany people in difficult, in conflict, and in complex situations. And then we're going to look at how Simeon and Anna, how they accompany Mary and Joseph at the temple. And then we're going to look at the prophet Joel and what it means to dream dreams and to build visions. So it's a little plan. I'm not sure how it'll all work out, but each time we'll try to have a sheet like this. You're probably looking at the sheet and saying, I wonder why you didn't follow everything that was on the sheet, but that's all right. We can kind of wing it a little bit, but is that okay? A little plan like that? And Tanya tells me that she'll, for those who might be watching online, she's going to post that discussion sheet a week ahead of time so they could download it and we can share in it together. Any questions about that? Is that a good enough start? Or do you get a little sense about what he's doing? I really think it's so wonderful, this idea that God spends himself. God empties himself, and that's why God accompanies us. He's already created us. He's got so much skin in the game, there's no way he's going to let go of us. There's no way he's going to give up on us. Look what he did to create us. He emptied himself to make us. You bet he's going to accompany us on our journey and stay with us the whole way. I love that image of God. I love the image of that every human being possesses a divine spark. I think that's really wonderful. Two of Pope Francis's subsequent encyclicals were a Laudato Si about the environment, and in that document, Pope Francis, we are related to every created thing. We are related to the fish, to the sun, to the water. We're related to everything in creation. And then his next one was Fratelli Tutti, all my sisters and brothers, and in that document he says, and we're related to every human being. Every human being. So between those two documents, Pope Francis is saying to the church, we're related to everything and to everyone, and we're traveling together. Nobody is traveling alone. I think that's a wonderful assurance for us. And it's wonderful to know that when you're feeling spent at the end of the day in your care for someone else or you're visiting with somebody else, you are doing exactly what God wants you to do, and you're imitating God perfectly. So thanks for that, and we'll celebrate Eucharist together here, and we'll learn a little bit more about family as we reflect on Jesus' family in the liturgy.